the gentleman's interested in the variability of different garden circumstances, in how the uniqueness of this setting may be impacted or necessitated David making, certain changes.
When there have been 3 versions, actually 4 versions now of Susurrus. The first was the one that was made for the Botanic Gardens in Glasgow, and then I rewrote 2 new versions, one to go in the specifically in the Botanic Garden in Edinburgh. And what surprised me when I did that was seeing how little changes needed to be made. That actually, having talked about that idea of site-specific, it made very few specific references to Glasgow, actually, and a lot of them actually were just in terms of, that maybe this garden is called, the perennial garden, and, so maybe we don't need to call it the perennial garden, we can just call it the garden. And so I made a version that deliberately stripped away all of those specific references and could go to any part, and then what remained is all of those other kind of, very detailed textual references. And that's worked very well, but what does change and does require a great deal of care in each place you go to is that I spend a day in the garden planning the route, and I walk and it's actually quite kind of surprising, I think, that the actual day spent planning the route is a very active day, and I do a lot of walking, and generally it's sort of the opposite of the experience that you want people to have in the piece. So that they're sitting very relaxed on a bed, and I'm walking around, with a stopwatch, and and often in the rain, because often I have to go in the autumn and do the visits then. But that requires very careful planning, I think, and a lot of that actually is very, very banal. A lot of it's to do with the fact that, for example, between track 7 and track 8, there's a particular piece of music which I think is narratively very important. Janet Baker singing Dido's Final Lament. And I think actually, I really want people to listen to the whole of that, so I need to have a route where the walk between 7 and 8 is long enough. And generally what I try and get is that we begin in areas which are quite manicured and quite kind of, where you feel there's been quite a lot of human intervention in the space, and quite formalized, and that where there are people around and you can see people. And then in the middle of the piece, you go off into more wild, unmanicured places, and then by the end you come back to where there are, you're a sense of where there are human beings around. So those are the things that I ideally try and get. And in terms of this garden, I think it works really beautifully in this garden. It's larger than most gardens, so there's more of a walk. But actually I like that. I think, everyone needs a good walk. You'll get over it.
Hi, yeah, I'm Eugene from Living Art, and I haven't seen Susurrus, but I was just wondering about the word you use, emotions rather than perspective, as I thought it might be. So I was just wondering why you choose to use emotions as a word because you want to give the audience a different emotion from what they usually have in their life. So why did you choose that over perspective?
The honest answer is I'm not really sure. I think for me it's something instinctive, and I think it's, psychology. I read a lot of psychology, and psychologists talk about this idea of there being visual learners or aural learners, and if you do one of those tests, to work out what you are, then I always come out as a kinesthetic person, someone whose focus is on emotions and physical sensations. And certainly my memory of key experiences from my life, if I think back to them, the first thing that comes back to me is how I felt, rather than what it looked like or what it sounded like. And I'm always very interested by those different people's, the way different people's memories work. Like people with gustatory memories, and you say to them, tell me about your wedding day, and the first thing that comes back to them is they can tell you the whole of the menu. And they don't really remember what their dress looked like, but but they can remember, that we started with scallops or whatever. And so I think actually that's just something that's quite deep rooted in me as a person. I think that's just to do with how I view the world, and wanting to kind of draw other people into doing that, I guess. And as I said before, it's about that. That's what I look for in another work of art. That's why I love a visual artist like Louise Bourgeois, because there's this great emotional content to the work. It's quite harrowing, a lot of it. The same thing with Pina Bausch, with these strong stomach contractions, or with Bjork, that she has this great, belting screech that, that you can't help but feel sort of moved by, I think. So, so for me, I think it's just that's who I am as a person.
I also from Living Arts, and I haven't had the chance to see the show yet, so I'm very excited to. And I was really interested in your whole idea of basing your show around emotion so much, and I was curious, when you sit down to actually make a piece, how much of yourself it takes to put together something that obviously has a large effect on the audience. So I was just curious how much of an impact it has on you to make something that requires so much effort.
It's a very interesting question, actually, because I was quite surprised with the piece that I wrote most recently. I've made a lot of very sad work and work that's quite sort of emotionally distressing, like Sub Rosa. And the mission that I gave myself with the new piece I wrote was a piece called Holy Kaylee, is that I had to write something joyous for a large audience rather than a small audience, and people had to, leave feeling kind of happy to be alive. And actually, but what I wanted to do was to try and do that without making that kind of cheap and nasty, and and so I thought what I needed to do, if you're going to have this ultimately very joyous, energetic narrative, is that you need to kind of compensate that with quite a kind of sturdy, muscular engagement with politics. And so the background of that particular piece is looking at the current battle for the world's food system, and particularly looking at the way that large corporations are genetically modifying seed and copyrighting seed, and trying to gain control over the world's food system. And doing all of the research for that actually was the most distressing thing that I've ever had to do. And it was the only truly depressing experience that I've had in writing a piece of work. And my producer had to kind of, take me in hand and say, you can't do this every day. You can't, read this work every day and then kind of, draw it deep down into your emotions and kind of churn it out through these characters, because it's just not good for you. And she was absolutely right in that I needed to kind of do a burst of it and then stop and go back to real life, because actually it's, to every day to be engaging with these ideas. Like, for example, Chiquita Bananas. A couple of years ago, Chiquita Bananas agreed to pay a fine for, I think, $125 million, because they had been funding paramilitary death squads in Colombia to protect their bananas, which is just staggering. And it's Chiquita Bananas. It's just bananas, and and I eat them, and and to be engaged with those kind of ideas. There are around 1,000 farmer suicides every month in India, related to to this genetic modification of seed. And so that was a very distressing thing to be involved with. And that surprised me, that actually with a piece like Susurrus, which is is intended to be so emotional, or a piece like Sub Rosa, which is very visceral, and it's about torture in many ways, and and that actually that was not really terribly difficult to write, because for me I'm very aware of the gap between myself and what I'm writing, and and that it's something that I've made up, and and also, as the person who made it, you're always aware of the mechanics of it, and you're always aware of the, what you could have done and what you didn't do, and and so you can always see the wizard behind the curtain, and it's always, and in many ways, that's the hardest thing when you're writing, is to try and see it from the outside and to see it how someone would see it for the first time, but yeah. So I suppose the short answer is that they take a surprising amount from you, but in ways that you don't expect. And that even now I'm surprised by the way that works.
I love the piece. We saw it yesterday and it was wonderful, but I'm intrigued with the title. The word wasn't familiar with, but how it's perfect. And did that come first or after?
Do you know, I don't remember. I really don't. I think it came during. Yeah, because it's a few years ago now, and actually, and the. Yeah, I think it came during. I think it came while I was kind of conceiving the idea of it, but before I actually sat down and wrote the narrative. I mean, obviously, because for those of you who don't know, the word Susurrus is a kind of whistling or rustling sound, particularly of the sound of the wind in the trees. Is the best example of Susurrus.
And it's kind of onomatopoetic.
Yeah. It's very onomatopoeic, this sense of rustling. And actually, sussurrare is the Italian word for whisper. And so I very often choose titles that are about. I love language, and so I like to kind of choose titles that give some kind of new piece of language. I used to teach English as a foreign language as my day job when I was younger, and I think there must still be some element of the teacher in me who's like, here's a new word, class, Susurrus. And yeah, and so the same thing with Sub Rosa and what other titles have I had? I had a piece called Paternoster, and yeah, I can't remember the titles. Oh, Verrocchio was a nice title of the piece. Verrocchio was an art teacher, but Verrocchio means good eye, and it was a piece about the way that the eyes work and about what we see, and in some ways similar to Susurrus, that it's about your role in engaging with seeing something. But he was called Verrocchio because he had a good eye.
Hi.
Hello.
I was curious how you got started with your field, like your specific field. Like what inspired you to go to do what you do today?
That's kind of hard to answer as well, actually. I've done it since I was very young. I started going to kind of theatre classes and things when I was 8 years old. I think actually probably quite soon after seeing that production of A Midsummer Night's Dream, looking back on it, there must be a link between them. And I first acted professionally when I was 12. And I did drama GCSE examination and then drama advanced level examination, then did a theatre studies degree. And so I knew from when I was, probably from when I was kind of 11 or 12, that I wanted to be an actor. And it was kind of between the ages of 16 and 18 that one of my teachers at school said, I don't think you really do want to be an actor. I think you're a director. And so I went, okay, so I'm a director, And so then through my degree and when I first left university, a lot of the work that I did was devised work where everyone kind of works on it together. Which was kind of, partly because that's the way that we'd been taught to make work. And I didn't think of myself as a writer at all, despite the fact that my dad always kept saying to me, you're a writer, you should be writing. And I would ignore him, as one should ignore one's parents. And then making these devised pieces, friends would come and see them and, they'd say, yeah, well, it was okay, bits of it, well, I like this bit. And I'd go, oh, no, that was my bit, I wrote that bit. And I remember my friend Rachel saying to me, why don't you just write them? Why do you keep doing these devised shows with these actors who just aren't very good at making up material? Why don't you just write good material and then get good actors to perform it? I was like, well, yeah, actually, yeah, that's true. And so I didn't actually write a play until I was about 27. And I wrote a triptych of 3 solo performances that I wrote and performed, which became the basis of my PhD. Because the PhD was a practice-based PhD where the shows are half of the submission and the thesis is the other half. And in the middle of that is what I talked about, that I came from this sort of performance art background, that the degree that I did was very much based in contemporary experimental avant-garde work, lots of studying of artists who were very much at the vanguard, and writing was not really very prominent in that. Writers, writing seen as quite antiquated in that sense. Though interesting, one of the people that I did study at university was Holly Hughes, who now teaches on the faculty here, and I was very excited by the fact that she came from this very experimental milieu, that it was very textual work. It was it was very much about language and about the manipulation of language. And I think someone like her or Neil Bartlett in the UK, who I think is a remarkable artist, I think that kind of stayed with me somewhere in the back of my mind. That then later, when I came to write, those were people that were very important to me. So I think it's a combination of lots of those different things all along the way.